Well, night one of adjusted level 4 of the lockdown, you're either hopping mad or believe it's the right thing to do. Some argue the National Coronavirus Command Council has failed to effectively deal with the pandemic, and it's for that reason we're back here. In fact, several experts say government failed to adequately prepare for the third wave, which has resulted in the latest crisis at medical facilities. So are the latest restrictions a result of incompetence? Let's find out from political analyst Eusebius McKaiser. He joins us live. So I guess that is the question, isn't it? Is it incompetence? What's your take?
Absolutely incompetence, I think we haven't spoken about enough, Shahan. And I think it is really because we give the president a free pass. I think if Jacob Zuma was in charge of the state, we would use far harsher language. We would have op-ed pieces that analogize to the years when we were fighting HIV/AIDS. We would have national tallies of how many preventable deaths we have experienced in South Africa as a result of the administrative bungling. So sure, there are aspects scientifically of the way in which the pandemic behaves that is beyond the president's control. But I'm afraid there is an absolute lot from a moral and political accountability point of view that the president and the government must answer for. And I think that we are treating the president with kid gloves.
Yeah, you know, that's the thing, that the president often comes onto our televisions every other week, and he's talking about getting 1.3 million new vaccines, 1.4 million vaccines coming to the country. Eusebius, that's a drop in the ocean. We have a population of well over 55 million South Africans, and the president expects us to be okay with those low figures.
It simply isn't good enough. I've spoken to the scientists, and we need to be only happy once we are jabbing about 200,000 per day. That is when you can say we are now really serious about getting to herd immunity. The kind of numbers we're talking about currently would take us far too long to make sure that the population is eventually safe. Besides that, as you've rightly also implied in your question, Shahan, is a lack of specificity at the level of organization and administration. I can't hold my president and my government accountable if I do not know the exact numbers of when and by when and how much they have ordered, when will things be delivered, and when will vulnerable people who have comorbidities be allowed, for example, to also get their jabs. And what you hear the president say is to give one or two numbers in the first part of a sentence, and then the rest of the sentence is very vague. So we have a lot of vagueness from the president. We've got new promulgations that basically put you and me on trial by suggesting that non-pharmaceutical interventions are the most important and the only way of dealing with the pandemic. Now, I don't want to say they don't matter. Of course they matter scientifically. But Shahan, if you analyze in terms of even just word count, how much time the president spent last night on the most important question, which is vaccinations, and how much time he spent wagging his finger at you and me for not physically distancing, for not masking up, for the gatherings that we've been attending. It is easy to talk about behavior and not to self-examine the incompetent state, the failed state, the looted state. But the reality is that vaccination should have been at the heart of the statement last night. And it's not a case, obviously, of either good behavior or vaccinations. You need the two to be mutually reinforcing in order to deal with the pandemic. But what President Ramaphosa did last night is unforgiving. The vaccinations, from a theme point of view, was an afterthought, precisely because it is easier to put the citizens on trial than to put your government on trial for poor behavior from an administrative point of view.
So let's talk a bit more about accountability, because as citizens, how do we hold this government accountable now? Because this pandemic is not going away anytime soon. We're talking about new variants. We have experts saying it's getting stronger and smarter. And we need politicians who are actually smarter here to deal with this pandemic. But we don't have that.
It is fundamentally about accountability, and we need to start with the small things that can make a huge difference from a discourse point of view and eventually from a political leadership point of view, because at the heart of accountability is the question of how do we improve the quality of political leadership, because the vaccination bungling is the result of poor leadership. Stop calling it a family gathering. The president is speaking at you. He's not having a conversation with you. When you start laughing at his unfunny jokes, you make it easier for him to feel that he can get away with poor behavior as a political leader. That's step number one. Step number two, we must insist that the most important question are precise, detailed questions around the procurement, the distribution, and the administration of the vaccinations. Step number three, we've got to ask tough questions about the funding to make sure that this economy is going to survive the pandemic. There was nothing about the vulnerable parts of the economy, such as the services industries, for example, in the speech last night. Those questions have got to be raised by commentators, by civil society, and by journalists. And of course, most importantly, from an elections point of view, we've got to make sure that the ANC-led government, Shahan, is aware that you and I, when we go into the election booth, will be effectively making sure that the question we ask ourselves is this a government that is fit for purpose? And if the pandemic is anything to go by, the ANC government is demonstrating that it isn't worthy of your vote and my vote. That is what accountability is about. And I think what we have done is, because the president is affable, because he is not Jacob Zuma, we're not asking the hard questions. But the reality is that we are in a similar position as we were in when people were needlessly dying during the worst parts of the Mbeki years with AIDS denialism. And that analogy is one that I'm happy to sustain in a longer debate with anyone who disagrees with me. The only reason why we're not using that kind of energetic comparison is because we love this man so much that we effectively lower the bar of leadership excellence for President Ramaphosa.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. So let's talk a bit more about Jacob Zuma. A very important decision that we'll hear from tomorrow at the Constitutional Court regarding whether or not he should be jailed for failing to appear before the state capture inquiry.
You know, tomorrow's judgment, which will be delivered at 10 o'clock, is critically important. It is one of those judgments where, quite frankly, nighttime talk shows on radio, on TV, we should have hour-long debates about the importance of tomorrow's judgment. And here's why it's important, the sort of one-minute version. The most important principle in a constitutional democracy is the principle of constitutional supremacy. In simple English, that means that the Constitution is more important than any one individual, any political party. It's even more important than Parliament and the executive. It is the ultimate benchmark for decent, lawful behavior. And the court tomorrow must answer two questions. The first question is Jacob Zuma in contempt of court? And the answer is plainly yes, because he has refused to comply with an order of the court. It cannot but answer that question in the affirmative. The more difficult question, and it's a question where I think even progressive lawyers can reasonably disagree, is what is the appropriate punishment for being in contempt? And it's going to be really difficult. Do you, for example, send him to jail? That could potentially make a martyr out of him, but purists will say the court shouldn't care about politics. If that's the best way to demonstrate that your authority should always matter as a court, then send him to jail. On the other hand, if you just give him a fine, someone might say it's a slap on the wrist. What is the point of finding that Shahan is guilty of contempt of court, but then effectively allowing him to write the check to get away with what he has just done? So whichever way you cut this thing, Shahan, there isn't any outcome tomorrow that won't be dramatic for the country, legally as well as politically, which is why I suspect it has taken them so long to puzzle through these issues. I think there's even the possibility that the court might not even have a unanimous judgment on this one.
Yeah, and I saw lots of people saying it's been a long time for this judgment to actually take place. If we follow the principle of no one is above the law, then it's pretty obvious what we should hear tomorrow, right?
Well, on the first question, absolutely. Remember, there are two legal questions the court must deal with. The second kicks in depending on your answer for the first. The first is he in contempt of court? And for that, he needs to both not have complied with the order, but intentionally so. And that's often the one that's missing in garden variety cases where there isn't successful contempt. But Jacob Zuma says, in case you really don't believe me, here's my intention. Let me write you a letter. Let me give another speech. I cannot see how any judge cannot but answer the first legal question in the affirmative. But then the question of punishment is a difficult one jurisprudentially, because the court is sitting both as a court of first instance, but also it is the highest court in the land. That's the first difficulty. The second difficulty is, as a result of that, it doesn't have the benefit of looking at a judgment that has come from a court below that it can work with as material. And then the third difficulty that it has is that Jacob Zuma arrogantly didn't file replying papers, which means it also hasn't had the benefit of legal argument from his legal team, which makes it really, really difficult to know how they will determine what is the most appropriate punishment. If the punishment is weak, it undermines constitutional supremacy. If the punishment underscores constitutional supremacy, like, for example, sending him to jail, then it will be a good day for us in terms of the law, but the political consequences will be interesting. And it will really test whether Jacob Zuma is correct when he dares the country into testing whether he still has political support across branches of the ANC. My own view is that we should call balderdash. He doesn't have the kind of support he had 5 years ago even. And if he is sentenced to jail, even a suspended sentence for that matter, then we can really test whether he's got the kind of support that he dreams about at night. But whether he will actually have it on the streets of the country, we'll know in the next couple of weeks.
Yeah, and you'll definitely see the populist, unhappy politicians within the ANC right there by his side, won't we? By the way, Eusebius, I was looking at your Facebook, and I have to weigh in on that debate about your warm shoes. No, you did not wear it outside your house. In your house, thank you. That's why it's called warm slippers, for indoors. He's a political analyst and legal analyst, Eusebius McKaiser. Thank you so much for your time. Always a pleasure talking to you.